It could rough me up, crack my ribs, bust my lip. It could do enough. Were you staying in your own lane? Were you passing on a steep grade? Out driving past Minum when the moon came up, I could see her. I had a fever, lit by the troubles of love. I was asking a question, what'd she say? She was answering one from yesterday. One saying fortune favors the bold and the far away from home. At Jordan Valley, she would gladly stop in at Mrs. E's with the shepherds and the wreckers to keep her company. Took a room at the old Basque Hotel. It was like a kind of a prayer when her eyelids fell. One saying fortune favors the bold and the far away from home. That river in the winter, it could rough me up, crack my ribs, bust my lip. It could do enough.
Good morning and welcome to this Oregon Voices Survey Project information session. My name is Mandy Elder. I'm a learning officer for research and communications at the Ford Family Foundation. On behalf of the Oregon Voices research team, we are thrilled to get to share through this panel conversation today about this first of its kind survey for our state. Oregon Voices focuses on the lived experiences of people and gives us unique data about the beauty, the community, and challenges in every Oregon county. We asked, what's it like in your corner of the state? And over 4,000 Oregonians responded. Today, our panelists, the leaders of the research team, will share about the why behind Oregon Voices and the Ford Family Foundation's investment in this project, what makes it so unique, some of what we're already learning from the data, and how you can use it in your community and organization. We'll have time in the second half of the webinar for Q&A. And so I like to point out the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please use that functionality to ask questions of the panelists throughout. And meanwhile, I and my colleague Sarah will share information with you in the chat. Sarah, I'll pass to you.
Thank you so much, Mandy, and grateful to folks tuning in from all around today from different sectors. We'd love to get to know a little bit more about you. So we're going to launch a quick poll for you. You should see that popping up on your screen soon. Should be in the bottom. And we just have a couple questions for you. We'd love to hear if you actually took the Oregon Voices survey and where you might be joining from, whether here in Oregon or outside of the state. We'll leave this open for just a little while to let folks tune in. We've got a little over 40 folks in the room with us today. And we were really excited to see that we had people from all different sectors, from government to philanthropy to nonprofit, representing every issue imaginable. And also some researchers in the room, some media. So grateful for your attendance. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and close this up and share the results. So as you can see, a quarter of you in the room have actually taken the Oregon Voices survey. So thank you, thank you. And half of you, this is maybe your first time learning about Oregon Voices. I'm really excited to unpack it for you. Where are you joining from? Lots of folks tuning in from rural Oregon, over half of you. A good representation, a third coming in from urban Oregon, and a couple folks tuning in, just one from out of state. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Manny so we can dive into the fireside chat with our panel.
Thanks, Sarah. I would like to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Ann Kubish, President and CEO of the Ford Family Foundation and the visionary behind Oregon Voices. We have Cassie Allen, our Director of Learning and Knowledge Management, who led the research team. And representing the Foundation's research partners in design, dissemination, and analysis, we have Debbie Elliott, Senior Research Associate at Portland State University's Regional Research Institute for Human Services. And we have Jade Aguilar, the Director of Research Equity at Echo Northwest. So as we begin our panel conversation, we'd first like to learn about the why behind Oregon Voices. And the survey project was really part of your brainchild. Could you and Cassie please share with us some of the history, how this got started, and why the foundation invested in it?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Our foundation, the Ford Family Foundation, focuses on rural Oregon and also county in Northern California. And we're really one of the few foundations in the country that has a rural mission. And so we're always looking for a way to lift up rural people, rural places, rural issues. And in Oregon, we're really sensitive to the fact that the narrative about Oregon is often dominated by what comes out of the urban centers, and the fact that rural issues and priorities don't easily make their way into state level policies and practices. And so we're always looking for a way to lift up the rural voice, and you'll hear more about how we designed this survey to be able to make sure that we heard rural voices in this Oregon Voices project. The second reason was that most of the survey data that's routinely gathered focuses on either fundamental facts about Oregonians, like demographics, income, education, health, and so on, or on attitudes and opinions. And when we brought together a group of community builders in a summit in 2017, we asked them, what was it that they would like to know about what's going on in Oregon in the day-to-day lives of Oregonians? And what they said is that they want to hear about how Oregonians live their lives, what they do, what's hard for them, what they love, what they celebrate. We really wanted to hear about what is going on in their communities and how they interact with their communities. And so this required a fundamentally different kind of survey. So it was really those two reasons that we got started down this road.
Thanks, Anne. And I would say that when you have a vision for something different than what's been done before, you know it's going to take more time, and you know you need to find the right partners to do the work that you envision. And so I think it took even more time than we imagined in that moment. So Anne and I started talking about this project back in 2017. And it took a couple years to really land the right partners at PSU and Echo Northwest, and to create an instrument that we felt really used the language of the communities that we serve and would speak to a broad cross-section of Oregonians and really make them feel invited to come in and reflect with us, as opposed to us trying to extract data from them. And so it really was not until 2020 that we were ready to roll. And then we all know what happened in 2020. So we had to slow our roll fairly significantly. We finally felt able to launch in the summer, late summer really, of 2021. By then Delta was coming back. So there is definitely a COVID element to the survey data that I think is important for all of us to think about. But it was also the logistics of things thinking through a random household phase, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail as we continue this morning, and an invitational phase where the foundation reached out to some of its beneficiaries. But in the end, we got it done, and it was important to take time so that we could get it right. Thanks.
Thank you both. You know, one thing I love about getting to read through the data that resulted from the survey is that you can really get a sense in the voices of people. You get a sense for the beat of each county, sort of the pulse of what's going on there and the feeling in that place, and what makes that part of Oregon unique to them. And that is, as you mentioned, in part because of the unique approach to designing the survey. Debbie and Cassie, could you tell us more about what makes Oregon Voices so unique, both for Oregon and our country?
Sure. Thanks, Mandy, and good morning, everyone. We have done many statewide surveys here through PSU, and we consciously decided that we had to approach this differently. And it's important because we needed to ensure that we could represent the voice of rural Oregon and rural Oregonians, which is commonly not done very well with regular random household surveys in particular. And so we leveled the playing field, and rural communities dramatically stepped up. It was wonderful being able to see the responses across counties and communities that we rarely hear from. And it was clear that they had things to say and that their sense of community was very strong. And we really appreciated all their willingness to provide that information. Cassie?
Yeah, I think a couple of things I would add. I believe most folks on this screen will know that Oregon has 36 counties. And it's also important to know that this work was coming off of the Foundation's Oregon by the Numbers effort, where we very intentionally try to focus on measures that are available for all 36 counties. And in doing that work, it becomes so clear that data gets suppressed in some of our smaller places. And as Debbie said, you know, so often what ends up happening in more traditional sampling efforts is that it's really the voice of 8 to 10 counties in Oregon, not the voices of all 36. And we wanted all 36 counties to feel like they had people showing up to report on what life was like in their part of the state. So what we did is in the random household phase, 500 households received invitations to participate in each of the 36 counties, regardless of their size. And then after that phase closed, we did this invitational phase where the foundation pushed out to its partners. But that random household design was something that has never been done in Oregon. And we this kind of targeted representation is it's rare in our field. So we were excited to be able to support it.
And can I add one thing? I just want to call out Wheeler County, because Wheeler stepped up more than any other county in the entire state, and that I've never seen. And I just want to say something to those folks in Wheeler. Thank you. It was great.
That was really cool. I think another piece that is worth mentioning is that we knew we wanted the survey to be bilingual, and we went back and forth between whether or not we should, push out in English and then people would have to request a Spanish survey. That didn't seem like a good idea. All communication for this survey, emails, letters from the president with the initial invitation, survey packets, had surveys in both English and Spanish. Everything was bilingual right out of the gate and throughout. And so I think that was important. We also had an opportunity, if people didn't want to complete a digital or paper survey, that they could complete the survey by phone. And we would have someone who could help them take the survey in English or in Spanish.
Thank you both. And I wanted to remind everyone, if as you're hearing our panelists speak, you have questions about the methods, anything else that's coming up for you, please put those in the Q&A box. We'll get to those in the second half of our time together. And so now, Anne and Cassie, can you share with us some high-level takeaways about what we have learned?
Sure, I'll start and then I'll ask you, Cassie, to fill in. I think that one of the things that we started out assuming is that there would be a striking difference between the kinds of responses we got from rural residents and urban residents. Because that's the way we talk about our state right now, is the great rural-urban divide. And I think that one of the big surprises was that the results between the rural and urban data just aren't as different as we had thought going into it. There's more commonality than we expected. And that was really heartening for us because it really gives us some information on which we as a state can base discussions around common ground, our shared fate, how the future of Oregon depends on rural and urban residents coming together. And we got some insights on the kinds of issues that they can come together around. So I'll give you a couple of examples on some of the things that were in common. And there were both some positive ones and some negative ones. And on the positive side, people love their communities. Wherever they live, whether they live in urban areas or rural areas, people love their communities. They love the community feeling that exists in their rural community, in their suburb, and in their urban center. And so that's across the board. And just as examples, a majority of residents, whether you're urban or rural, report that they attend community events, that they volunteer in their communities. So those are examples of how people really engage in their communities. On the not so happy side, whether you're rural or urban, a majority of people agree that jobs aren't paying enough. And things like people are having trouble making ends meet. So that's where I think we see commonalities, and I think it's important to keep exploring the data and use that data as a way to bring our state together. At the same time, there are differences between rural and urban. And one of them I think wouldn't surprise us. It has to do with community mindedness. So rural folks are a lot more likely to say that they take care of each other during hard times. They know their neighbors, they come together to solve community problems than in urban areas. So it's really fascinating, and I encourage everybody on this webinar to explore some of those urban-rural differences and see if you're sort of as surprised as we were about the commonalities, and see if you can identify some of the ways that there are differences that actually don't surprise you. Cassie, what would you add to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that I was just overwhelmed and humbled by people had a lot to say. One of the things about this survey is that there were 14 different places where there were open-ended responses, which is actually uncommon for a project of this size and scope. And it's created a pretty heavy lift for our Echo Northwest partners, which they valiantly rose to the occasion. But even I've told this story a couple times, but there was the last question on the survey about anything else you want to tell us, and sometimes you'll get a thanks, nope. We got paragraphs from hundreds of people who, even after answering all these questions, they had more to say. And so that just tells me that this survey was answering a need for people to feel heard. And that was true both in urban spaces and rural ones. I do think it's important to acknowledge that when you look at what daily life is looking like, it is different. For urban and rural residents, we have thousands of people who are able to walk to grocery stores, walk to a doctor's office. And we have thousands of people who need to drive hours to do either one of those things, where there is no grocery store in their town. Dollar General is the closest thing. Walmart is the only place to buy clothes. Those are some significant differences. And so those amenities are different. However, we also have, urban folks who say they have more ready access to healthy food than rural folks, but rural folks who are growing their food more than urban folks. Urban folks who need to drive hours to really experience a dark sky where they can see the stars. And thousands of folks for whom that is their daily life. They are stewards of the land, and they get to live in that majesty on a daily basis. And all those things are true for Oregon, and it takes all of us. And so I think that's really the power that I see in this data, is that we are not the same. We are living different lives, and we are choosing to live those different lives. There are just some folks that would rather be around a lot of people. They'd rather be able to use public transportation all the time. And there are others for whom they'd rather be on a horse, frankly, and they would actually like to have their neighbors miles away. And that's okay. It's all Oregon. And I hope that, this survey allows us all to see the good and to see the differences. And we're all better off if we're not the same. But we do clearly have some very common, I would say, things that we appreciate and things that concern us as Oregonians in this particular moment in our state's history. Housing being probably a big one that has not come up yet.
Can I just jump in and share a couple of other little insights that I love looking at the rural urban difference between some of the questions. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that a majority of Oregonians do not go to church. Whether you are rural or urban, you do not attend church. A majority do not. If you're rural, you are more likely to go to church. 43% go to church, whereas if you're urban, it's 23%. So that's one interesting thing. Another one that I was particularly interested in is who reports that they vote and who doesn't. And is there an urban-rural difference between that? And urban folks vote more than rural folks. About 60% of urban folks vote, whereas 47% of rural folks vote. And I think that's an interesting takeaway when we look at the political makeup of our state. So those are just a couple of additional little highlights I wanted to share.
Thanks for that, Anne. I do think the one, if there's one that everyone takes away from this work, I think, and that I hope we all get more curious about, is that because of the narrative that we are living in right now about this urban-rural divide, I think Oregon Voices provides a lot of data that disrupts that narrative, at least for our state. It may look different in other states, but in Oregon, I think it's important that we are not getting this polar situation that is so often being spoken about in our midst.
Very nicely said. Speaking of housing, that's one of the topics that we wanted to be sure we had some discussion on. It's one of the biggest themes that came up in every county in our state, housing availability, and if you can afford it. For example, we have a quote here. One person from Tillamook County shared, we do not have affordable housing or services for those not so well off. An increasing number of people are living in vehicles and RVs. Jade, can we turn to you? Could you please elaborate for us on what the data say about people and their experiences with housing in Oregon?
Yes, thank you, Mandy. This is definitely one of those that jumped out for us as a real concern across the state. And again, some very common themes that emerge in every county, as well as some variations among more rural or urban centers. But when asked, what concerns you about your community, 10% of folks mentioned something about housing, and usually that had something to do. There were also other questions, quantitative questions that asked about housing satisfaction, all kinds of stuff. So we've kind of done a broad review of all of those questions that have anything to do with housing, including, what Cassie was talking about at the end, where people are just offering more input. So collectively looking at that as a whole, we see that, availability is a real issue, that there just aren't enough homes, both in urban and in rural areas, for folks to live in, which then causes an affordability issue. And so we see a lot of folks really recognizing that even if they're stably housed, even if they own a home, that they see that it's a real problem for others who are looking to get into home ownership, or even just to rent in their community, that there really isn't anything available. And I think that even for folks who are feel good about their own housing, we know that it's affecting them because they talk about how, you know, teachers, medical providers, other folks aren't able to live in the communities and offer the services that they and their families need because there isn't enough housing for those folks to live there in an affordable way. There was also some comments about sort of long-term or short-term rentals taking up some of the housing stock as well, and, you know, creating great recreational opportunities for folks to come visit communities, but that also takes away some of the housing that's available for long-term residents. And then a big issue, and again, across the state, was the issue of homelessness and people experiencing homelessness. So we know that in urban areas, this was a more acute issue, that people raised that as an issue that they saw as a real concern. But a third of rural Oregonians, also 35%, mentioned that homelessness was a big problem in their communities. And so that's, you know, we see that everyone is experiencing this critical lack of adequate housing, and the way that it's affecting folks is different, but that it is affecting every Oregon community. Renters in particular across the state mentioned that, you know, the availability and affordability of housing in their communities was, you know, even more acute. So we know that for those folks, at least, probably thinking about even the potential of, you know, being able to maybe own a home was really challenging. And trying to think if there was so much around housing. And, you know, one of the exciting things that we're doing now is we're writing up some issue briefs that can kind of really focus in on some of these topic areas that became, that really rose to the top as some of the main issues. And so I'd love to hear more of your questions around housing, and happy to take those. For now, I will pass it over to Mandy or anyone else who wanted to jump in there.
Thanks, Jade. Yeah, let's move along. There's so many topics that came up in the survey. There's so much that we can learn from it. And we know that at the foundation, we'll be mining this data set for a long time, asking questions and learning from the voices in the survey. Debbie and Cassie, could you please speak to how people listening in right now, we have people from, I'm seeing all over rural Oregon, the Mid-Willamette Valley, in the Illinois Valley, we have Douglas County here, but also statewide nonprofits like RDI, peer foundations as well. Hello, everyone. I see a Ford Scholar on our attendee list also. Can you speak to how people might use this data in the Oregon Voices website?
Sure, I can start with that. As has been mentioned, we got, and this is a technical term, oodles of data. Over 4,300 people. The survey has many, many, many questions in it, and we appreciate the time people took to complete those. And because there are so many questions, so many topics, as well as a lot of information about who the people were that completed the survey, it's huge, it's massive. And so, as I always tell people whenever we have a rich data set like this, is just be curious, ask it questions, think about what's in there and decide, do I want to look at that relative to this subgroup of individuals, or do I want to look at the comparison between these two groups of individuals on a particular topic? And it's always fun to take a data set this size with both numeric data, ratings and counts and things, as well as qualitative data, and look at how it all combines and just ask it all the questions you have. Cassie, do you want to add to that?
I would echo what Debbie is suggesting here. I think, you know, now that the summary data has been shared, we really go after those county reports, pull up a couple counties that you're interested in and compare them. Compare two counties that you think are really different from each other and find out where things are similar. We're going to be giving a tour of the website here in just a moment, but I would just put an exclamation point on what Debbie has suggested here, and also reach out to us. If you have thoughts about where you hope some of these research briefs might head, housing is definitely going to be the first, but there are other topics bubbling to the surface. We hope that there will be conversations that happen within organizations, within communities about, does this data reflect your story? One of the things that happens with survey data that I think is very important to point out is that when you invite people to take a survey, those that are best positioned to answer are the ones that do. And so there's a tendency for folks who are retired, who might have a little extra time to respond to a survey more than really busy students or people in the prime of their life juggling childcare and jobs and so on. So that is something to sort of be aware of in the data, and we want to know whether or not what's there, and if the people who spoke for your county, if their views reflect your own, or whether you have a different opinion on something. Mandy and I just had the privilege of doing a session with our Ford Scholars last weekend, and a workshop with them looking at the Oregon Voices data. And I have to say, I was really heartened by the extent to which they were calling out some of the same things that we heard from Oregonians who were much older than them. But I'm not sure that that's going to hold as we continue. So I would just really, wherever you're seated in your organization, in your community, we just hope that people will pull it up and have some conversations and think about what window this provides into the community and the extent to which maybe your opinions are the same, different, maybe it offers an opportunity for something your community to work on.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that last point, Cassie, that you said. So we at the Ford Family Foundation, we are a community building organization. In other words, we really believe in the power of communities to come together to problem solve and make their communities better. And sometimes having data to look at and talk about and share can be a catalyzing and mobilizing event. And so if people are eager to bring their communities together, you could use these data and this data set to bring people together, examine the report on your county and say, is this right? Well, for example, everybody reported that there isn't enough childcare. That's kind of interesting. Or everybody reported that youth don't have enough good places to hang out. You've already heard Jade talk about how people are talking about homelessness. If this kind of survey data is such a powerful organizing and mobilizing tool, and we as a community building organization, we're going to use it for that, and we'd encourage others to do that as well.
Yeah, and this made me think of an important distinction that we're making internally is that, we've done Oregon by the Numbers for a number of years. Our 6th edition of that report will be coming out in September. And that feels like data about the community. It's collected by our public systems and so on. This is really data by the community. So we see those as very important distinctions. And we hope there might be folks that have the opportunity to you've got a county profile in Oregon by the Numbers, you got a county profile in Oregon Voices. How do those two things talk to each other? Where do you see the similarities? Where is there an opportunity to learn more? So yeah, that's our hope.
Thank you all so much for your expertise, your vision, sharing your knowledge, and for your leadership on Oregon Voices. And now continue asking your questions in the Q&A box. We have time just in a few minutes. For now, we're going to transition to Sarah, who's going to give us a full overview of the Oregon Voices website so that we all know how to use it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mandy. Hopefully in a few seconds now, everyone can see my screen. Here we are at orvoices.org. When you get that in your browser and land here, this will just give you a nice high-level overview about the survey, a lot of which you just heard from our research team. When you go to the first section here on About Oregon Voices, there's going to be a lot of information contained in here about our approach, the 2 phases of engagement. You can see across the state by county, kind of how that squares out. How to interpret the survey findings and more information on the methodology. When you go to the Your County tab, which is the second at the top, we have this lovely map of Oregon, but also alpha ordered all the counties. So you can click on a county, it's going to pop up for you, and you can see the full profile with all the data gathered specific to that county, with some key highlights that we've curated for you at the top. Again, some more background information about the summary itself, and really nicely paired kind of the numeric data, as we've discussed, with some of the data from the voices, from the folks that wrote in responses and took time to share their lived experiences with us. So this is what a county profile looks like. And there are a couple other sections on this site that I really want to spotlight for you before we turn to the open Q&A. And this is the Explore the Data section. This is where you can take time to really filter and toggle through the data to your liking. So here I'm going to just show you community infrastructure, for example. So right now, we're looking at the data statewide across the entire sample. So you can see specific to these questions, this is how people are rating things like schools, access to healthy food, affordable housing, the extent to which they agree and disagree with these statements. And you can kind of go through each of the topics at a very high level. What I want to really showcase here are the filters. What's nice about these filters is you can drill down by respondent group, you can go by geography, you can select certain counties, and you can also pick multiple categories. So for example, I'm going to just do Baker. I'm going to focus in on the young population. And I want to show you that this is really key. We have elected not to display data for cases where we don't have enough to show for more than 20 responses for a specific group, just to protect the confidentiality of those who participated. So this is specific to Baker County at a broad level, but you can apply those filters. So I did just want to show that one feature there. So another piece here that is very distinct in this section is the voices data. When you come here, again, you can navigate across the map. So I'm just going to jump down to Morrow County and show you what this looks like. So here we have the qualitative data, the quotes from the community. And this is really rich. You know, it's someone from Morrow County shared, it is diverse in ages and traditions. Some are very open to change. Some are wholly against it. All agree we need to preserve our small town feel and not just develop for the sake of developing. We have a lot of the same challenges in our small town as large communities do, only on a smaller scale, but we don't have anonymity. So we are fortunate to be able to show care. And we make eye contact, smile, say hello, help each other out when it's needed. We choose to live here. So just to give you a sense, you know, we've heard some of this already in our conversation and our discussion, but these really kind of bring to life a lot of the data that we have populated in the county summaries. So hopefully this is kind of a nice flyover, help you kind of get oriented to the site and how you can navigate its contents. And then in this final section, Engage, this is where many of you may have come to register for today's event, but this is where we're also going to be putting opportunities for community conversations, research briefs that we'll be rolling out in the coming months. So please stay tuned. And again, if you have any questions for us, we have a contact form and we'd love to hear from you. So with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And we will dive into the open Q&A. Thank you for sending in your questions.
Thanks, everyone. We have a lot of interesting questions here. One that I think might be helpful to start with, and Debbie and Cassie, perhaps this is a question for you. Could you speak to the reliability of the data? Is it statistically significant? We have a question, for example, from Lincoln County, where there were 92 respondents. How might someone interpret that?
Okay, I'll give it a shot first. because we had two components of data collection, both a random household survey and engaging folks that are in some way friends of the foundation in a way. We can look at the random household survey and think in terms of, we absolutely randomly selected 500 households from each county, and we were able to get a sufficient number in each county to be able to speak to what the thoughts and feelings and experiences are within those. We did not calculate the margin of error with each county because it didn't seem as appropriate, since we are looking at the data as a whole. So for the random household survey, we are confident about the randomness of that, and the engagement piece of the data just adds much more content and context to the whole data set. You have anything to add, Cassie?
I would just add that this is whenever you're doing voices research and you're trying to reach into the nooks and crannies of a state that is comprised the way that Oregon is, you really, I'm a big fan of a gentleman named Michael Quinn Patton. You can look him up if you would like. He's an evaluator that I admire greatly, and we were not looking for statistical significance across this survey. We were looking for participation. And we structured the random household survey in such a way that we would have a scientifically reliable comparison for then our outreach, engagement, or invitation survey. So anybody who wants to talk further about that, I would encourage you to email oregonvoices@tfff.org, and we can continue that conversation. Thanks so much.
We have a question here concerning the level of feedback that we fielded from Latinx Spanish-speaking folks, or also other kind of underrepresented groups across the state. Was it what we were hoping for?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit, Sarah, and others should jump in. I would say in terms of people who identify as American Indian, that group is actually overrepresented in our sample when you compare to the state of Oregon, which is really remarkable. When it comes to our Latinx population, that group is underrepresented. Despite our efforts, obviously it wasn't enough. We did some things that we hope would engage those groups, and hopefully we'll be able to do this survey again, and we will try some different strategies. We definitely heard from a significant group, but we would have loved for that group to be larger, and we'll make every effort the next time we do it for that to be the case.
Thanks, Cassie. And here's another question that I know you'll think is interesting about what is frontier Oregon? How do we think about frontier? How do we think about rural?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure how to drop links in the chat in this situation, but rural, the frontier definition is actually a USDA definition in terms of what's frontier. There's something called frontier and remote area codes. There are levels of being frontier, being remote, and I would encourage people to Google that and look it up. In this, for our survey work and our analysis, we cut the data two ways when it comes to looking at what is rural. One is that at the Ford Family Foundation, we maintain a rural zip code list that has to do with how we view rural communities, which basically our definition is that any community that is smaller than 35,000, not adjacent to a larger metro area, we consider that community rural. There is one exception, the town of Grants Pass, and that's a whole other conversation. But we also use the Office of Management and Budget's definition of rurality. In this survey, we let people tell us whether they considered their survey rural, their community, whether their community was urban, suburban, rural, or frontier. And so with the summaries, we based those on how people saw their communities. right? So when you look at that breakout on the county summaries, those are based on respondent assessment of the place that they live. And if that sounds muddy, it is because we have many, many definitions of rural. There is no one definition. Our federal agencies use more than a dozen. If anybody else wants to speak to that, please do. And if you're interested in this year's upcoming Oregon by the Numbers report, we actually dedicate this year's data highlight to this definition of what is rural, because the Census Bureau, after many decades of using the same definition, has actually changed their definition, and that's going to have ripples throughout our systems.
We have an interesting question about whether some of our state leaders have accessed and looked at these data yet. Anne, I'm curious, given your role and sitting on the Early Learning Council and this sort of thing, we can't confirm necessarily that state leaders have already looked at this, but we have been actively promoting the survey to them. And I'm curious your take, Anne, on how policymakers in particular might action the information that came out of Oregon Voices.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So we are just in the beginning of disseminating this, and we, as Sarah says, we're going to continue to try and make sure that the survey data and the results and the analysis gets out. And as Jade said, we will be doing white papers, and hopefully they will hit on topics that policymakers are really interested in. I would encourage us all to try and make sure that policymakers get access to it. I think we all know that policymakers have easy access to leaders, or they have to respond to the loudest voices. And what's so beautiful about this survey is that this is a cross section of residents, and it's a much more representative cross section than maybe they hear on a day-to-day basis. And again, I would just reiterate one of the themes that we want to share in this whole webinar, which is the beauty of the fact that there is much more commonality than I think that maybe even our political leaders would expect in this state, and that there's much more opportunity for common cause. So encourage your political leaders to take a look at this. We will be sharing it more deliberately over time, and hopefully they will hear the voices of real Oregonians through this survey.
It strikes me that thank you, Anne, one of the questions that we haven't touched on yet too much is the really bold choice about mailing those paper packets across the state and receiving such a high response rate to the paper mailing and reminder. Cassie and possibly Debbie, would either of you like to talk about that?
How about if I start and Debbie can jump on in? I think with the foundation's work in other areas across Oregon, we were fairly certain that we needed paper in order to get into the nooks and crannies that we were hoping for. It's one of the things that actually made this survey very expensive to conduct, because not only the printing of 18,000 packets with multiple surveys in them, it's the letter before that, all the postage and whatnot, but it was really heartening in the random household survey that half of the respondents used paper. And as the surveys were coming in, it was this sort of, Debbie would send us the update every day. It's like, oh, the digital survey's winning. Nope, paper's in the lead. Oh, digital survey's winning. And they went neck and neck right down to the very end. And I think the digital survey ended up winning out by just a couple. But we heard from Oregonians, actually, there was a little bit of a lag when Anne's letter went out inviting people to participate. And at that point, we were saying, please, if you can, call us to take the survey or follow this link. And we started getting telephone calls at the foundation saying, I don't have a cell phone. I don't have a computer. I don't want to take this at the library. Am I going to get another way to take the survey? And then very close on the heels, those paper surveys started to appear. But I'm very happy and proud that we decided to invest in the paper surveys. What's interesting is that with the foundation invitation, we printed the surveys in Spanish and English in anticipation that people would want to do that, but that group was much more likely to take the survey digitally, which I think is just a reflection of who they are, their position in community. I don't know, Debbie, if there's anything else or anybody
Yeah.
from the team.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I mean, there's a trend in the survey research community to rely a lot more on what is easier. What is easier is pushing out polls on cell phones and providing a web link to do a survey. But unfortunately, that leaves out a large proportion of people who want to participate. And back in the day, decades ago, there was always concern about using multimodal or using both paper and phone or web that biased the data in some way. But what we've learned is making the survey available in multiple ways actually broadens the net and allows different people who choose those different modalities to participate. It actually improves the breadth and it decreases the bias, which is what we did.
Okay, we have another question here about more opportunities to engage with Oregon Voices, if there will be more research briefs, conversations like this in community, and if even the survey will be conducted again. Cassie, would you like to take that?
Sure, I'll start and then we can, others can fill in. Happy to report that our board of directors has definitely expressed interest in us conducting the survey again. We are anticipating 2026, possibly 2027, but hoping for 2026 to conduct the survey again. We have great aspirations to get out on the road with this data a bit and to be in conversation with communities. Actually, we can do that by Zoom as well. If you have a group that would be interested in having those kinds of conversations, we would love to hear. We've done some of that work with Oregon by the Numbers over the years. That work has not yet begun with Oregon Voices, so we would love to know if you see an opportunity. And then I think, as we've mentioned earlier, the research briefs are ongoing. Housing will be the first. Others are in the pipeline, as they say, and if you have a particular topic that you really hope we will pursue and summarize, we would love to hear from you. And you could use that email or any of our individual emails. Be great.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Cassie. And with that prompt, actually, we are going to do a quick poll of everyone concerning our forthcoming research briefs. As we've already mentioned, we will be doing one on housing and the state of issues around affordability and availability across the state. But we'd love to kind of gauge the folks' interest in this room about some of the topics that we could pursue in the next one that we release. And while we're doing this poll, Anne, do you just want to share some final comments before we close up here? I'll share the results of this shortly.
Sure, I appreciate that there's so many people who are on this webinar, because I think that we at the Ford Family Foundation really do believe that this survey and the data are true treasure. And as Debbie said, there's very few surveys and data sources that deliberately try to do as many things as we tried to do in this survey. We had quantitative information, we had qualitative information. Therefore, we needed PSU to be a partner, and we needed Jade and Eco Northwest to be a partner to help us look through the cross-section of data and different data types we had. We really wanted to make sure that we heard rural voices, and you heard this sort of sampling strategy that we had, where every single county, including Wheeler, including Sherman, including Morrow, all had 500 surveys sent out. And so it's just an unusual cross-section of efforts that required that we as a foundation were privileged to be able to lead. But we needed the help of so many different kinds of experts and from PSU and from Eco Northwest and so many different community connections to make it actually work. And so I feel like we as the Ford Family Foundation realize what a privileged position we're in, and we want to be able to do this in a way that helps Oregonians come together for the future of this state. And so I hope that we get to do this again in 5 years. As Cassie said, our board is really pleased about this, and it's the kind of contribution that we feel proud to be able to make.
Thank you so much, Anne. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share the results of the poll. We have strong interest in education and childcare as an upcoming topic, quickly followed by local government and leadership. So thank you so much for participating in that poll, and you can see the results now. I do just want to note quickly for folks that as we roll out these forthcoming research briefs, we see that as another opportunity to do more info sessions and gatherings like this. So we hope that this has been helpful and that you've enjoyed engaging with the whole research team here, and grateful for your time on a Friday. Enjoy the weekend ahead, everyone. As a quick note also, this recording will be living on our orvoices.org website under the Engage tab. So if you ever want to revisit it, it can be found there. So thank you again all.